This is NDTV, and you're watching NDTV 24/7.
We're at the beautiful Carlton Gardens, and with me is a very beautiful panel to discuss something which perhaps today everyone is talking about during breakfast, dinner conversations, especially many Indians perhaps. And before I get into the topic, I'd like to discuss starting with the lady, introducing Geeta Sehgal, Director of Centre for Secular Studies, James Ferguson, former journalist and former editor of The Independent, and of course David Loyne, who's covered Kabul extensively. Thank you very much. This is about intolerance, and we've been speaking about it several times now, and especially in the recent past, not just in India, but perhaps in Britain as well. And I'm curious to start with the Britain context. There are different levels of intolerance we see, and there are different forms to intolerance, right? One cannot really define it. In the context of Muslims living here, and given the research that you are in, what at this stage concerns you as a citizen here?
I suppose it's the fact that the way that Muslim issues in the UK are being reported is not balanced. So there are statistics that show that for every story that mentions a moderate Muslim in British Muslim society, there are 20 negative ones, and 20 stories about potential extremists or something kind of negative and horrible. So if you're a British Muslim and looking at that, we have a tradition of a free speech here, free press here, and balanced reporting, and that has been, it's the bedrock of the fourth estate, if you like, in here, and we're just not getting it at the moment. There is a sense, a very real sense among British Muslims that they are being persecuted, really, through the media and also by the government, who are in the midst of a campaign to root out extremism, and they call it non-violent extremism. They're going after violent and non-violent extremism because that's where the violent terrorism comes from, they think. But they haven't really defined what they mean by extremism. So, and that's very dangerous, because it could mean anything. It could mean segregation in schools. It could mean not shopping at certain shops, because so there are all kinds of ways of
divisions at different levels.
That no one is really sure what the indicators of extremism are, and the media particularly have filled up this gap by kind of making their own suggestions, if you like, and I think that's created a very difficult, frightening atmosphere for a lot of British Muslims. I've been going around the country talking to them, and that's what I'm hearing back.
It's important you say that, James, that the media has perhaps are you indicating that there is a sense of stoking intolerance? Is that what you mean?
Among certain journalists, I think that's certainly the case. There are individual journalists on certain papers who have decided to pursue a certain kind of narrative.
Right.
Perhaps for their own careers, for whatever reason it is, but that is going on.
Indeed. But it's important you say that. Is that happening in India, Geeta, given...
It Britain, actually, because I work on these issues as well, and I work on it from the point of view of spreading the idea of secularism in social matters to British society, coming from the subcontinent, and coming from India specifically, because these were ideas that I grew up with, and they're not here. The British state, and a lot of British journalists, even very well-meaning ones, cannot see people who are brown or black as secular. They have to be within some kind of community. It used to be within racial communities, but now, increasingly, people are defined as being only within religious communities. People have singular identities. This is something that Amartya Sen has criticized very heavily, and I completely agree with that, because I've been criticizing what a multicultural social policy, not the plural society that Britain has become. In many ways, Britain is a very tolerant and very secularized society, and people have a lot of life chances here that they wouldn't have had in the countries that they came from.
Not,
in some ways it's not, because there is, as James says, an agenda to show Muslims in a particular light, and a lot of that is very wrong-headed journalism, is biased journalism. But journalists have also taken on the task of doing investigative work, very serious investigative work, and it's tarred with the same brush. So anytime somebody exposes Muslim fundamentalists, they are called Islamophobic.
Sure.
That is what is happening in this country.
Sure. And that's very unfortunate to really generalize either the media or perhaps the society or this community.
Well, the generalization is this, that there is massive intolerance being promoted by the government and by a lot of people in society against the influx of outsiders, so against migrants and refugees at a time when Europe is facing the greatest refugee crisis that it has faced since the Second World War. And there has been a very, very appalling reaction, I think, by this government, frightened of its votes going to more right-wing groups, frightened of its own right-wing within the Conservative Party, with its own instincts. And that has also got mixed up with anti-Muslim feeling, that a lot of these people who are fleeing are Muslims. So many of us who actually work on Muslim fundamentalism are saying, look, the people who are fleeing these things. They're fleeing from these disasters that they are. They will come here, and yes, there may be problems with integration and so on, but one, there's a humanitarian need to integrate them. And they will actually provide a more secularized narrative in many cases. What happened with Bangladeshis coming to this country as students and so on was that they raised the issue of war crimes. There was an older generation who had kept that issue alive, and the rest of it came from young students. In between, there were the generation that were absolutely educated by the Jamaat-e-Islami and other groups, in fact by war criminals who had fled here from Bangladesh and who had become much more fundamentalist. And the Hindutva, going back to India, the Hindutva lobby is very strong in this country, has a lot of shakas, there are RSS shakas operating in this country. So you have the fact that you have citizens of second or third generation, but who are being educated in various forms of religious fundamentalism. In one case, the Prime Minister has lined up with some of those fundamentalists with the Hindutva lobby. He's made statements against the Muslim fundamentalists, but he's also lined up with Saudi Arabia, promoted them in the Human Rights Council, worked with them very closely, and is promoting Saudi Arabian fundamentalist groups in the context of Syria.
Is it a case of Jekyll and Hyde? Well, is intolerance only at this stage being perceived as something to do with the Muslim Islamic community, because there are different forms of intolerance that we see, isn't it?
Yes, and I think we're seeing extremes worldwide, polarizing on the right and left, and certainly on the religious side as well. Sure. It's much more difficult living as a Christian in Pakistan than it was before, and there are plenty of Christians in Pakistan. Sure. It would be terrible if it became much more difficult to live as a Muslim in parts of India, and that's the fear of this sort of extremism and the sense of this polarization that's happening right across the world. So you have a far more simplistic agenda that's being put. So it's not, of course, just about the Muslim world, and although we're very focused on that in Britain, and understandably from the government's point of view, they're trying to find their way through this thicket because they perceive a terrorist problem. But it doesn't help that Muslim equals terrorist in British newspapers. There's a real sort of simplification in the way that it's all being discussed. So I think I would appeal for much more sense of understanding and context, but often you don't get that at times of general elections, and you certainly have intolerance increasing at times when there's political fear in the air, and that shows that there are politicians who are engendering that.
There is a sense that among the people that it's about time you speak up, even if it means being behind the identity of being anonymous on a Twitter handle. You say what you have to say, and is that the way to control certain measures, perhaps by the institution, which may be controversial?
Well, on the one hand, too many people are speaking up. I mean, that's what you get with social media.
And reacting rather sensitively.
Yeah, these debates kind of erupt on Twitter and take off into a sort of life of their own, very often forgetting the facts that are, it's no relation to kind of what actually happened in the first place. And so there's a rush to judgment by the public often, which is quite new and quite scary. But on the other hand, there is this issue, and I think the more serious one, which is that the government here has not really defined what it means by extremism. It's struggling to do so, and it's trying to, and it's very difficult to do. I mean, it's difficult, but
I'm not sure it's easy to define extremism.
well, it's not. But if you confuse it with religious conservatism, then you're in trouble. You're on a sticky wicket, and that's what's going on. And what it means is that people, you know, school kids, Muslim school kids. I've met lots of parents who are specifically telling their children when they go to school, do not discuss politics because a teacher at your school may get the wrong end of the stick and think it's an indicator of extremism. You'll get reported to the authorities. So, you know, the Muslims in this country have traditionally always talked a great deal about foreign policy, about what the West are doing in Afghanistan or Syria. That discussion has stopped, according to teachers that I've been speaking to, and they're quite scared by that. They're amazed. So where's it gone? And this is the danger, is that, of course, it hasn't stopped. It's just gone somewhere else.
But the intolerance is not only one way, James. I mean,
Yes.
you know, you have a large number of young British Muslims have views that are you know, pretty socially unacceptable for the majority community about homosexuality, about Israel, about the role of women in society. And so I think, you know, the intolerance is not just a one-way street. On this issue, and getting some kind of real dialogue with, as it were, the majority community, although there's a huge number of Muslims, I mean, and many parts of Britain where there's a very significant Muslim majority, which of course gives them significant political authority and power and a sense of a new kind of dialogue. But in that dialogue, we have to have more debate about the things, the social norms that are now taken for granted in Western countries, particularly around sexual equality.
The whole politics of the subcontinent is represented here. So there's the PPP, the Communist parties, the Congress, the Hindutva movement, you know, Muslim League, they're all here, and they're all represented in various workers' associations and this and that. The religious groups were also represented here, but they have been nurtured and given money and charitable status and so on. So I don't know, I agree with James that the government doesn't know how to define extremism. I can define it as religious fundamentalist movements where the non-violent movements are not non-violent at all, but they're violent abroad. And the British state has had a dreadful pact with these movements that you don't commit violence in this country, go and do what you like abroad. So for instance, the whole discussion about ISIS and the threat of ISIS and people joining ISIS is that they may come back and plant bombs here. And I say, well, what about the fact that Britain is exporting jihadis to murder and rape and pillage other countries? You know, imagine if Indians were flooding into Britain in order to plant bombs. You know, they would be talking to the Indian government saying, what the hell are you doing?
I can't say that there be tolerance in the society. That would be just too idealistic, given we also enjoy multicultural, multi-religious establishments here and in India. But to just allow people to breathe and to have as peaceful as a society that can be. Thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Out of England. Radhika Iyer signing off. You can write your feedback to ooe@ndtv.com.